Margaret adjusted her reading glasses and settled into her favorite armchair by the window, the one that gave her the perfect view of the Hendersons' house across the street. At 50 years old, she had lived in this quiet suburban neighborhood of Portland, Oregon for nearly 2 decades, long enough to know every family's rhythm, every secret whispered behind closed doors. The December air was crisp, and frost crystallized on the window panes as she prepared to tell this story, the one that had haunted her thoughts since last Christmas Eve. She had always prided herself on reading people, on understanding the unspoken tensions that lived in the spaces between hello and goodbye. But what she witnessed that night at the Hendersons' home would shatter every assumption she had carefully constructed over the years. The story began on a gray December afternoon when Margaret noticed the unusual amount of activity at the Henderson house. Cars lined the street, their exhaust creating small clouds in the freezing air, and she could see shadows moving behind the warm, golden-lit windows. Tom Henderson, the elderly man who lived there, had always been somewhat of an enigma to the neighborhood. He was 73, a widower who kept mostly to himself, tending his garden in summer and clearing snow from his driveway in winter, with the determined silence of someone who had learned to live with loneliness. His daughter Victoria visited occasionally from Seattle with her teenage daughter Amber, but these visits seemed more obligatory than loving, more duty than devotion. Margaret had been preparing her own modest Christmas dinner when she heard the raised voices carrying across the frozen lawns. She moved closer to her window, not out of nosiness, she told herself, but out of concern for Tom, who had seemed frailer lately, his steps slower, his shoulders more hunched beneath the weight of years. Through the Hendersons' dining room window, she could see the family gathered around a long table decorated with red candles and pine branches. Tom sat at the head, his weathered hands folded on the white tablecloth, while Victoria and her daughter Amber sat along the sides, their faces animated in conversation that seemed to exclude him entirely. The dinner appeared tense, even from a distance, with Victoria checking her phone repeatedly and Amber scrolling through her own device, the blue light illuminating her young face with an eerie glow. Tom attempted several times to engage them in conversation, his mouth moving, his hand gesturing toward the food he had clearly prepared himself, but they barely acknowledged him. Margaret felt a familiar ache in her chest, the same one she had felt when her own children had grown too busy for her, too absorbed in their own lives to remember that she too had dreams, fears, and stories worth hearing. She watched as Tom stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, and began serving the turkey he had roasted. Then it happened. The moment that would set everything in motion. Amber, 17 years old, with streaked blonde hair, and the casual cruelty that sometimes comes with youth, said something that made her laugh, a sharp, mocking sound that carried through the double-paned windows and across the cold December air. She was looking directly at Tom, her eyes bright with amusement. And even from across the street, Margaret could see the old man's face change, the light in his eyes dimming like a candle flame struggling against wind. Tom's hand trembled slightly as he set down the serving fork, and for a moment he simply stood there, frozen in a posture of profound hurt. Margaret leaned closer to her window, her breath fogging the glass, her heart suddenly beating faster with an inexplicable sense of anticipation. She had witnessed countless family dramas from this window over the years, arguments about money, affairs uncovered, children disappointing parents, and parents failing children. But something about this moment felt different, charged with an electricity she couldn't quite name. Tom remained standing at the head of the table, his silver hair catching the candlelight, and then slowly, deliberately, he did something that Margaret would never forget. Something that would change not only how she saw him, but how she understood the very nature of dignity, love, and quiet revenge. What happened next unfolded with the careful precision of a chess master making his final decisive move. Tom reached into his cardigan pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope, yellowed with age and handled so many times that its edges had softened like fabric. He placed it on the table in front of Amber, whose laughter had died in her throat, replaced now by confusion and the first flickering awareness that perhaps she had misjudged something fundamental. Victoria looked up from her phone, her expression shifting from annoyance to concern as she noticed her father's unusual stillness. The way he stood with the quiet authority of someone who had finally decided to speak a truth long buried. Tom's voice when he spoke was soft but clear, carrying the weight of years and wisdom hard-earned through loss and perseverance. Margaret couldn't hear his exact words, but she could see their effect. The way Amber's face drained of color, how Victoria's hand moved to her mouth, covering what might have been a gasp or a sob. The envelope remained on the table, untouched, a small rectangle of paper that somehow contained enough power to shift the atmosphere of the entire room. Tom remained standing, his posture straightening slightly, as if in speaking he had shed some invisible burden he had carried for too long. The scene held for a long moment, frozen like a photograph. And then Amber reached for the envelope with trembling fingers. She opened it carefully, almost reverently, and Margaret watched as the girl's eyes moved across whatever was written or contained within, her expression transforming from confusion to shock to something that looked remarkably like shame. Victoria leaned over to see, and Margaret observed the precise moment when understanding dawned on the mother's face, followed by what appeared to be tears streaming down her cheeks. Tom still hadn't moved, standing there like a sentinel, watching his daughter and granddaughter process whatever revelation the envelope had delivered. Margaret realized she was holding her breath, her hands pressed against the cold window glass, her mind racing with questions. What could possibly be in that envelope? What had Tom revealed that could cause such a dramatic shift in the room's energy? She had known him for years as the quiet widower who kept his lawn immaculate and always waved politely when they encountered each other at the mailbox, but she realized now that she had never truly known him at all. Everyone carried secrets, she supposed, histories and hurts and triumphs that shaped them in ways invisible to casual observers. The dinner continued, but everything had changed. Amber set down her phone and didn't pick it up again, her attention now fully focused on her grandfather, her body language shifting from the slouched dismissiveness of before to an engaged, almost urgent attentiveness. Victoria wiped her eyes and reached across the table to take her father's hand, squeezing it in what looked like an apology or perhaps a plea for forgiveness. Tom finally sat down, but he sat differently now, with the quiet confidence of someone who had reclaimed something precious, some dignity or truth that had been slowly eroding under the weight of dismissal and disrespect. Margaret watched until the candles burned lower and the scene across the street softened into a tableau of reconciliation. The family remained at the table long after the food must have grown cold, talking, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing in the way people do when wounds long festered finally begin to heal. She couldn't shake the image of that envelope, so small yet so powerful, and she wondered what truth Tom Henderson had finally chosen to reveal. The night deepened, stars appearing in the clear December sky, and Margaret finally stepped back from her window, her mind full of questions that demanded answers. The next morning arrived crisp and bright, with new snow covering the neighborhood like a fresh page waiting to be written upon. Margaret bundled herself in her heavy wool coat and knit scarf, the one her daughter had sent from Boston 3 Christmases ago, and ventured out to retrieve her newspaper. The cold bit at her cheeks and made her eyes water, but she barely noticed. Her attention focused on the Henderson house, where smoke curled lazily from the chimney and morning light glowed warm in the kitchen window. She saw Tom outside, shoveling his walkway with the same methodical determination he always brought to physical tasks. But something about him seemed different, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. Margaret approached slowly, her boots crunching in the fresh snow, rehearsing in her mind how she might casually inquire about the previous evening without appearing too nosy. But Tom looked up before she could speak, and the smile he offered her was so genuine, so unguarded that her prepared words evaporated. He leaned on his shovel and gestured toward his house, inviting her in for coffee with a simple wave that felt more like a summons than a suggestion. She hesitated only a moment before accepting, her curiosity overwhelming her usual reserve, and she followed him up the cleared path to his front door. The Henderson house smelled of pine and cinnamon, with lingering traces of last night's turkey dinner mixed with fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen. Tom moved through his home with comfortable familiarity, retrieving mugs from the cabinet and pouring coffee that steamed in the cool air. Margaret settled at his kitchen table, the same one where last night's drama had unfolded, and noticed the envelope still sitting there, now empty, its contents presumably in Amber's possession. Tom saw her looking at it and smiled, a sad but peaceful expression that spoke of old pain finally acknowledged and perhaps beginning to heal. He began to talk, and Margaret listened with the intense focus she usually reserved for her favorite mystery novels. Tom's story unfolded slowly, piece by piece, revealing layers of a life she had never imagined existed behind his quiet exterior. He had been a photojournalist in his youth, he explained, traveling the world to document wars, famines, revolutions, and moments of extraordinary human courage and cruelty. His wife had supported his career, even when it meant months apart, even when the nightmares he brought home were as heavy as the camera equipment he carried. But everything changed when Victoria was born, and he had made the difficult decision to give up the work he loved, to be present for his daughter. The sacrifice had been profound and largely invisible. Tom had taken a job at the local newspaper, covering city council meetings and school board elections, photographing ribbon cuttings and high school graduations instead of the moments that changed history. He had done it without complaint, channeling all his creative ambition into being the father he believed Victoria deserved, attending every recital, every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game. His wife had understood what he had given up, had thanked him with every kiss goodnight and every quiet moment they shared over morning coffee. But after she died 5 years ago, that understanding died with her, leaving him alone with memories no one else seemed to value. Victoria had grown up taking her father's presence for granted, never quite understanding that his ordinariness was a choice, not an inevitability. She had always been slightly embarrassed by him. Tom admitted with painful honesty, wishing he had been more successful, more impressive, someone she could brag about at her corporate job in Seattle. She had never asked about his past, never inquired about the boxes of photographs and journals stored in his attic, never considered that the quiet man who always showed up might have stories worth hearing. And Amber, raised in her mother's shadow, had inherited that dismissiveness, seeing her grandfather as nothing more than an old man who lived in the past. The envelope, Tom explained, had contained a single photograph, one he had taken in Sudan in 1984, during the famine that had shocked the world's conscience. It showed a mother clutching her child against her skeletal frame, her eyes looking directly into the camera with an expression that contained both unbearable suffering and fierce, defiant love. The photograph had won international awards, had been published on the cover of Time magazine, had moved people around the world to donate millions for relief efforts. It was the kind of image that defined a generation's understanding of humanitarian crisis. And Tom had taken it, his finger on the shutter, his heart breaking behind the lens. But it wasn't just the photograph itself that mattered, Tom continued, his voice growing quieter, more reflective. It was what happened after. The recognition, the awards, the offers to continue that kind of work, to become one of the defining photographers of his era, to document history as it unfolded across continents and conflicts. He had turned it all down because Victoria was 3 years old and needed her father home, needed his stability more than the world needed his photographs. His wife had cried when he made that decision, not from disappointment but from love, understanding the magnitude of what he was choosing to give up and why. Margaret sat motionless, her coffee growing cold in her hands, stunned by this revelation. The quiet widower who lived across the street had once stood at the intersection of history and art, had captured moments that changed how millions of people understood suffering and humanity, and he had walked away from it deliberately, choosing the small moments of fatherhood over the grand stage of international recognition. It was a sacrifice so profound, so completely selfless, that she struggled to fully comprehend it. How many school lunches had he packed that might have been spent in war zones? How many bedtime stories had he read that could have been captions on photographs that changed policies? Tom's eyes held hers, and she saw in them decades of unspoken longing mixed with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. He had written all of this in a letter that accompanied the photograph, explaining to Amber why he had seemed like just an old man to her, explaining what he had given up and why, explaining that love is often found not in what we achieve, but in what we choose to sacrifice for those we hold most dear. The letter had been his attempt to help her understand that every ordinary person around her likely carries stories of extraordinary choices, hidden sacrifices, and roads not taken for reasons that matter more than accolades or recognition. Amber had called that morning, Tom said, his voice catching slightly with emotion. She had apologized, really apologized. Not the superficial sorry of someone caught being rude, but the deep, transformative apology of someone who had genuinely understood they had been wrong. She wanted to hear his stories, she said, wanted to see the other photographs, wanted to understand the grandfather she had dismissed as irrelevant to her modern life. And Victoria had promised to visit more often to ask questions, to stop seeing him as a burden or an obligation and start seeing him as a person with a history worth knowing and honoring. Margaret realized she was crying, tears running down her weathered cheeks as she absorbed the weight of Tom's story. She thought about her own children busy with their lives across the country, and wondered what sacrifices she had made that they had never known about, what dreams she had deferred or abandoned completely to give them stability and love. Don't all parents do this? She asked quietly. Don't all of us give up something for our children? Tom nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of her words, but added that the giving up isn't what matters most. It's whether those we sacrifice for ever truly see us, ever really understand that we are more than just the roles they needed us to play. The conversation stretched through the morning with Margaret and Tom trading stories of their lives, their losses, their moments of quiet heroism that no one had witnessed or acknowledged. She learned that he still had contacts in the photojournalism world, that young photographers sometimes wrote to him asking for advice, that his work was still referenced in textbooks and exhibitions even if his name had faded from public consciousness. He learned that she had once been a promising pianist, had given up a music scholarship to care for her ailing mother, had never regretted the choice but sometimes heard melodies in her mind that her hands would never play. They recognized in each other the familiar pattern of lives shaped by love and sacrifice. As Margaret finally prepared to leave, wrapping her scarf around her neck and pulling on her gloves, Tom walked her to the door and thanked her for listening, for bearing witness to his story. She hugged him impulsively. This neighbor she had observed for years but never truly known, and felt his thin frame relax into the embrace. Outside, the December sun had climbed higher, making the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds across the quiet suburban landscape. She looked back at Tom, standing in his doorway, this man who had once captured history, and then quietly stepped into the smaller, more intimate history of family life, and she understood finally that heroism comes in many forms. Some flashy and public, others so quiet they're almost invisible. The days between Christmas and New Year passed in a blur of cold weather and quiet reflection. Margaret found herself thinking constantly about Tom's revelation, about the photograph that had changed everything. She dug through her own boxes in the basement, searching for evidence of the person she had been before motherhood, before widowhood, before the accumulation of years had gradually narrowed her life to this small, predictable orbit. She found programs from recitals she had performed in, reviews from local newspapers praising her interpretation of Chopin, a letter from the music school she had turned down, all yellowed and fragile as the envelope Tom had placed on his dinner table. She also found herself watching the Henderson house with new eyes, no longer as a voyeur seeking entertainment in other people's dramas, but as someone who understood that every window frames a story more complex than any observer could guess. She saw Amber visiting several times, staying longer each visit, and once watched as the girl and her grandfather walked together to his garage, emerging with boxers that must have contained his photographs and journals. They spent hours inside, and Margaret imagined them poring over images of suffering and beauty, of moments frozen forever in silver gelatin and chemical baths. Each photograph a testament to what Tom had witnessed before choosing the different testimony of daily presence. Victoria came too, making the drive from Seattle on a random Wednesday when most adult children would be busy with work and responsibilities. Through her window, Margaret watched mother and father embrace on the front porch, a long, tight hug that spoke of reconciliation and perhaps apologies finally spoken and received. The afternoon light caught them in its golden hour glow, and Margaret thought about taking a photograph herself but decided some moments are better held in memory than captured in pixels. Some truths are more powerful when they remain private, shared only between those who need to understand them. New Year's Eve arrived with unusual warmth for Portland, the temperature rising just enough to turn snow to slush and create that particular kind of mess that winter can produce. Margaret had no plans beyond watching the ball drop on television, a tradition she had maintained alone for the past 5 years since her husband died. But around 7 in the evening, there was a knock on her door, and she opened it to find Tom standing there with Amber, both bundled in coats and looking slightly nervous. They had come to invite her to their small New Year's celebration, just the 3 of them, plus Victoria, who was bringing dinner from a local restaurant. Margaret hesitated, part of her wanting to decline, to maintain the comfortable distance between observer and participant that had defined her life for so long. But Tom's eyes held a gentle insistence, and Amber smiled shyly, and she found herself saying yes, found herself grabbing her coat and following them across the snow-covered street to the Henderson house. Inside, Victoria greeted her warmly, and Margaret was struck by how different the atmosphere felt from that Christmas Eve dinner she had witnessed. The tension had been replaced by something softer, more genuine, the kind of comfortable presence that marks families who have faced hard truths and chosen to move forward together. They ate around the same dining room table where everything had changed, but now it was set with mismatched plates and simple decorations, and the conversation flowed easily among them. Tom told stories about his travels, about narrow escapes and moments of beauty found in the midst of chaos, and Amber listened with the rapt attention of someone discovering that history is not just dates in textbooks but lived experiences of real people. Victoria shared memories of her childhood, moments with her father that she had forgotten or undervalued, and apologized again for not seeing him clearly. Margaret contributed her own stories, surprised to find that people actually wanted to hear them, that her life held interest beyond her own remembering. As midnight approached, Tom brought out a bottle of champagne he had been saving for something special, and they counted down together, their voices joining in unison as the old year gave way to the new. When the cork popped and fizz overflowed the glasses, they toasted 2 new beginnings, to really seeing each other, to understanding that every person carries depths that patience and attention can reveal. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again, but they were different tears than before. Tears of belonging rather than isolation, tears that acknowledged she had been welcomed back into the community of people who matter to each other. She hadn't realized how lonely she had been until that moment when loneliness lifted. After the toast, Tom disappeared briefly and returned, carrying a large portfolio. the kind professional photographers use to store and display their work. He opened it carefully on the cleared dining table, and they gathered around as he showed them photographs from his years documenting the world. There were images of war that made Amber gasp and Victoria look away, but also images of profound beauty, children playing in refugee camps, lovers reuniting after years apart, old women praying in bomb-damaged churches. Each photograph was a story, and Tom narrated them quietly, explaining the context. The moment he pressed the shutter, what happened before and after that frozen instant. Then he pulled out photographs of a different kind, personal ones he had taken over the years of ordinary life. Victoria as a baby, as a child, losing her first tooth, as a teenager rolling her eyes at something he had said. Family vacations to the Oregon coast, Christmas mornings, graduation ceremonies. The photographs were technically perfect, composed with the same expert eye he had brought to his professional work, but they captured something more intimate, more tender. These were not images meant to change the world, but to remember it, to hold on to moments that mattered precisely because they were small and fleeting and shared only among people who loved each other. Margaret understood then what Tom had been trying to show his granddaughter on Christmas Eve. It wasn't just that he had been someone important once, someone whose work mattered on a global scale. It was that he had chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of what he was giving up, to document a smaller story, the story of one family, one life. The accumulation of ordinary days that add up to a lifetime of love. The photograph from Sudan that had won awards was powerful, but no more powerful in its own way than the photograph of 3-year-old Victoria reaching up to hold her father's hand, her face full of trust and joy. As the first hours of the new year stretched past midnight, the conversation turned more philosophical. Amber, with the earnestness of youth confronting new ideas, asked her grandfather if he ever regretted his choice, if he ever wished he had pursued the career that could have been his. Tom was quiet for a long moment, and everyone waited, understanding the importance of his answer. Finally, he said that regret is too simple a word for complex choices, that he sometimes wondered about the road not taken but never wished he had actually taken it. The life he had lived, he said, was the life he wanted to live, even with its disappointments and invisibilities. Victoria reached for her father's hand, and Margaret saw decades of misunderstanding beginning to dissolve in that gesture. Amber asked if she could borrow some of the photographs to show her friends at school, to do a project about her grandfather's work, and Tom's face lit up with pleasure at the request. They talked about setting up a proper display of his photographs, maybe in the local library or community center, not as a monument to what he had achieved, but as an invitation for others to share their own stories of sacrifice and choice. Every community, Tom said, is full of people who have given up something for love, and those stories deserve to be told. Margaret listened and contributed, but part of her mind was already racing ahead, thinking about her own basement full of forgotten sheet music and programs, wondering if it was too late to reclaim some part of that earlier self. She was 50, not dead, and her hands still remembered where the keys were even if they hadn't touched them in years. Perhaps she could offer piano lessons to neighborhood children. Perhaps there was still time to make some kind of music before the silence became permanent. The thought excited and terrified her in equal measure. But watching Tom's face as he shared his work, she understood that revealing yourself, letting people see who you really are beyond the roles they've assigned you, is always terrifying and always necessary. The evening finally wound down around 2 a.m, with everyone exhausted but satisfied, the particular satisfaction that comes from meaningful connection. Tom walked Margaret back across the street, insisting, despite her protests, that it was no trouble. They stood for a moment on her front porch, the neighborhood silent around them except for the occasional distant firework or shouted celebration. Tom thanked her again for listening that morning in his kitchen, for being the witness to his story before he shared it with his family, and she realized that perhaps she had played a small but important role in giving him courage to reveal himself. She asked him what had finally made him decide to show Amber the photograph, to break his years of silence about his past. He thought about it, then said it was actually something Margaret herself had done weeks earlier, though she had no memory of it. She had complimented him on his Christmas decorations, simple white lights strung along his porch, and mentioned that they reminded her of something beautiful she had seen years ago but couldn't quite place. That small acknowledgement of beauty, of his ability to create something worth noticing, had lodged in his mind and made him think about all the other beautiful things he had created that no one knew about, that his own family had never valued because they had never been told. Margaret was stunned by this revelation that such a small comment could have such large consequences. It reminded her that we never really know how our words and actions affect others, how a casual kindness can shift someone's entire trajectory. She thought about all the years she had watched her neighbors without really engaging with them, observing but not participating, and she wondered how many opportunities for connection she had missed. How many stories remained untold because no one had asked or listened? She resolved then, standing on her porch in the first hours of the new year, to be less of an observer and more of a participant in the life happening around her. The winter days that followed were still cold and gray, but something had shifted in the neighborhood's emotional atmosphere. Margaret began taking daily walks, stopping to chat with neighbors she usually just waved to, asking questions about their lives with genuine curiosity. She learned that the young couple 3 houses down were both teachers struggling with student loan debt, that the elderly woman on the corner had been a botanist who discovered a new species of lichen, that the seemingly perfect family 2 streets over was dealing with a son's addiction with grace and determination. Everyone, she discovered, carried stories worth knowing, sacrifices worth honoring, complexities worth acknowledging. She also started making inquiries about teaching piano, placing a notice at the local community center, and mentioning it to neighbors with young children. To her surprise and nervousness, she got several responses, and by mid-January, she had 3 students coming to her house twice a week. The first time she sat at her piano to teach, her hands trembling slightly as they found the keys, she felt something inside her uncurl and bloom. Some part of herself she had thought permanently dormant, returning to life. The music that emerged was rusty at first, halting and uncertain, but it was real, it was hers, and it mattered. Tom became a regular visitor, stopping by for coffee and conversation, and Margaret found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation she hadn't felt in years. They talked about everything and nothing, about the past and the present, about their children and their choices, about what it means to live a good life when no one is watching or applauding. Sometimes Victoria joined them, sometimes Amber, and gradually Margaret found herself part of something she hadn't quite realized she needed. A chosen family of people who saw each other clearly and accepted what they saw. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, just a subtle shift from isolation to connection. One February afternoon, when rain was turning the last of the snow to gray slush, Tom brought over a box of photographs he thought Margaret might want to see. They were pictures he had taken recently around the neighborhood, capturing the ordinary beauty of their small suburban world. A child jumping in a puddle, light breaking through clouds after a storm, an old dog sleeping on a porch, Margaret herself playing piano visible through her window. She was startled to see herself captured that way, absorbed in her music, her face holding an expression of contentment she hadn't known she possessed. Tom explained that he had started this project as a way of honoring the choice he had made all those years ago. If he had given up documenting the world's big dramas to be present for small, domestic moments, then those small moments deserved the same attention and artistry he had once brought to war zones and disasters. Every ordinary life, he said, contains extraordinary beauty if someone takes the time to really look, to really see. These photographs were his way of proving that truth to himself and to anyone else who might doubt that the quiet choice of family over fame could be as meaningful as any other path. Margaret held the photograph of herself playing piano, studying it carefully, seeing herself as Tom had seen her, as someone worthy of being photographed, of being documented and remembered. She realized that this was what she had been missing all these years. Not attention exactly, but acknowledgement, the simple recognition that her life mattered beyond its utility to others. She asked Tom if she could keep the photograph, and he smiled and said he had printed it specifically for her, that it belonged in her hands because it captured something true about who she was and who she was becoming. They talked about mounting an exhibition together at the community center, combining his neighborhood photographs with programs from her musical past, and maybe inviting other neighbors too, contribute their own stories of deferred dreams and quiet sacrifices. It could be called something like The Roads We Didn't Take or The Lives We Chose, a celebration of all the invisible choices that shape communities and families. Tom was enthusiastic about the idea, and Margaret found herself getting excited too, imagining how such an exhibition might help other people feel less alone in their compromises, less invisible in their sacrifices. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, Margaret noticed other changes in the neighborhood, subtle shifts in how people interacted with each other. Perhaps it was just her own increased awareness, but it seemed like people were talking more, lingering longer at mailboxes and on sidewalks, asking deeper questions and listening more carefully to the answers. Tom's revelation about his past had somehow given everyone permission to be more than their assigned roles, to reveal the complexity beneath their suburban surfaces. The neighborhood was still quiet, still orderly, but it felt less like a collection of separate houses and more like an actual community. Amber started visiting her grandfather every weekend, taking the bus from Seattle where she lived with her mother during the school year. Margaret would see them working together in Tom's garage, now converted into a makeshift dark room and studio, and she felt a profound satisfaction knowing that she had played a small role in building this bridge between generations. Amber was learning traditional photography from Tom, using film instead of digital. Understanding the chemistry and patience required to develop images in a dark room, the girl was changing, becoming less absorbed in her phone, more present in her body and her surroundings. One Saturday morning, Amber knocked on Margaret's door with a camera hanging around her neck. One of her grandfather's old film cameras he had given her. She asked shyly if Margaret would let her take some photographs while Margaret played piano, explaining that she was working on a project about artists in the community for her senior year at school. Margaret agreed, touched by the request, and soon lost herself in her music while Amber moved quietly around the room. The soft click of the shutter barely audible beneath Chopin's nocturnes. Later, Amber showed her the contact sheets, tiny versions of all the photographs she had taken, and Margaret was amazed by the girl's eye, her ability to capture moments within moments. The exhibition planning moved forward through March and April, with more neighbors contributing than Margaret had imagined possible. The botanist from around the corner brought specimens she had collected and journals from her field research. The teachers contributed student artwork alongside their own essays about why they chose education despite the financial challenges. A retired chef shared recipes and stories about the restaurant he had always dreamed of opening but never did. Each contribution revealed depths and complexities, dreams deferred and alternative paths. And Margaret felt honored to be collecting and organizing these stories, to be bearing witness to so much hidden richness. Tom worked tirelessly on curating the photographs, selecting images from his professional past alongside his more recent neighborhood documentation. He created a timeline showing his career arc, from war zones to school plays, from international acclaim to local obscurity, and he wrote captions that explained his choices without justifying them, that honored both what he had been and what he had become. Margaret watched him work and understood that this exhibition was his way of finally integrating his past and present, of showing that both versions of himself were real and valuable, that nothing had been wasted or lost, only transformed. The exhibition opening was scheduled for the first Saturday in May, coinciding with the community center's spring festival. Margaret spent the week before in a frenzy of preparation, helping to hang photographs and arrange displays, writing program notes and coordinating schedules. She was more nervous than she had been about anything in years, worried that no one would come, that the whole effort would be an embarrassing failure. But Tom remained calm, telling her that the value of the exhibition wasn't in how many people attended but in the fact that they had created it, that they had refused to let their stories remain invisible and unspoken. The day of the opening arrived, warm and bright, the kind of May morning that makes everyone in Portland forgive the long gray winter. Margaret woke early and dressed carefully, choosing a blue dress she hadn't worn in years and adding a scarf her daughter had sent. She felt both excited and terrified, vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in decades. She walked to the community center alongside Tom and Victoria and Amber, the four of them moving together through the flowering neighborhood like a family, which in some meaningful way they had become. The community center was already crowded when they arrived, far more people than Margaret had expected or hoped for. Neighbors she recognized and many she didn't filled the main hall. Studying the photographs and reading the posted stories with genuine interest and attention, she heard people exclaiming over Tom's professional work, impressed by his accomplishments but equally moved by his neighborhood images and the choices they represented. She saw the botanist explaining her specimens to a group of fascinated children, saw the teachers surrounded by parents asking questions, saw people connecting and recognizing each other in new ways. Her own small display of concert programs and sheet music seemed humble compared to Tom's powerful photographs. But people stopped to look at it, and several approached her to ask if she still played, if she might consider performing sometime. One woman mentioned that her mother had attended one of Margaret's recitals 30 years ago and had talked about it for weeks afterward, remembering the beautiful young pianist who had made Chopin sound like prayer. Margaret felt tears threatening again, not from sadness but from the overwhelming emotion of being seen, of being remembered, of learning that her music had mattered to someone even though she had thought it forgotten. The afternoon stretched into evening, with people lingering long after the official opening hours, reluctant to leave the warmth and connection they had found. Someone suggested that Margaret play something, and before she could protest or decline, a small, upright piano was rolled out from a back room where it was used for children's music classes. The crowd quieted expectantly, and Margaret found herself sitting at the piano bench, her heart pounding, her hands trembling slightly as they found the keys. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play a Chopin nocturne, the same one her mother had loved, the same one she had played at her last recital before giving it all up. The music filled the space and Margaret felt herself dissolving into it, becoming nothing but sound and emotion, the accumulated years of silence breaking open into melody. Her hands remembered better than her mind, carrying her through passages she thought she had forgotten, finding expression she didn't know she still possessed. When she finished, the silence held for a long moment before applause erupted, genuine and warm, and Margaret opened her eyes to see Tom smiling at her, his own eyes wet with tears, and she understood that this was what he had tried to tell her about making visible what had been invisible, about claiming your full story even when parts of it seem lost. The success of the exhibition led to unexpected opportunities. A local newspaper ran a feature story about Tom's career and his choice to prioritize family, and suddenly there was renewed interest in his work. A gallery in downtown Portland contacted him about a proper show, and a publisher expressed interest in a book combining his professional photographs with his essays about sacrifice and choice. Tom was bemused by the attention, grateful but not changed by it. Still content with his small life and his renewed connection with his daughter and granddaughter, he had learned, he said, that recognition is nice but not necessary, that the value of your choices doesn't depend on whether anyone applauds them. For Margaret, the exhibition marked a turning point in her own life. She began performing regularly at the community center, small recitals for neighborhood audiences who appreciated her music. With the kind of attention she had only dreamed of in her youth, she took on more piano students, finding deep satisfaction in passing on her love of music to another generation. She also started writing, putting down on paper the stories she had observed and the insights she had gained. Not sure if anyone would ever read them, but understanding that the writing itself mattered, that bearing witness to life was a worthy endeavor regardless of audience. The friendship among Margaret, Tom, Victoria, and Amber deepened throughout that summer and into the fall. They celebrated holidays together, traveled to the Oregon coast for a weekend trip, spent long evenings on Tom's porch watching the neighborhood settle into darkness while talking about everything and nothing. Margaret felt grateful in a way she had never quite experienced before. Grateful not just for what she had, but for what she had almost missed. For the connections she might have never made if she had remained behind her window, observing but not participating, seeing but not being seen. Tom's health began to decline the following winter, his long life finally catching up with him in ways that couldn't be ignored. Margaret visited him daily, bringing soup and books and her simple presence, sitting with him as he grew weaker and more confined to his bed. They didn't talk much during these visits, both understanding that presence is its own language. But sometimes Tom would tell stories about his travels, his marriage, his daughter, his choices, and Margaret would listen with the attention she had learned he deserved. Victoria and Amber were there too, taking turns caring for him, making sure he was never alone, honoring him with their attention in a way they had failed to do before. On a cold February morning, with snow falling softly outside his window, Tom died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by photographs he had taken and people he loved. Margaret was there, holding his hand, along with Victoria and Amber, the three of them forming a circle around his bed, bearing witness to his last breaths. It was sad, but also beautiful, the kind of death everyone hopes for, surrounded by love and acknowledgement. Having lived a life that mattered in ways both public and private, grand and intimate, Margaret wept, but her tears were for her loss, not his. Understanding that Tom had lived exactly the life he wanted, had made his choices consciously and honored them fully. The funeral was well attended, with people from the neighborhood alongside photographers and journalists who had known Tom's work. Victoria spoke beautifully about her father, acknowledging both what he had achieved in the world and what he had given her through his daily presence. His consistent love, his choice to be there instead of somewhere else. Amber read a passage from one of Tom's journals about the moment he decided to give up his career, about watching baby Victoria sleep and understanding that witnessing this one small life grow was as important as witnessing history on a grand scale. There wasn't a dry eye in the church, everyone recognizing themselves in Tom's story, everyone understanding that we all make versions of his choice every day. Margaret spoke too, surprising herself by volunteering, telling the assembled crowd about the Christmas Eve dinner she had witnessed, about the envelope and the photograph, about how one moment of revelation had changed not just Tom's relationship with his family, but her own understanding of what makes a life meaningful. She talked about invisibility and recognition, about the stories we carry that no one knows unless we choose to reveal them, about the importance of bearing witness to each other's full humanity. Her voice shook but held, and afterward people thanked her for her words, saying they would remember them, saying they would try to see more clearly the people around them. In the months after Tom's death, Margaret became even more committed to the work they had started together. She organized more community exhibitions, encouraging people to share their stories and hidden talents, creating spaces where the invisible could become visible. She continued her piano recitals, now dedicating them to Tom's memory. playing pieces that reminded her of his quiet strength and his willingness to honor what mattered even when no one was watching. She also began writing more seriously, working on a collection of essays about the neighborhood, about observation and participation, about what she had learned from Tom about living with intention and courage. Amber graduated that spring and chose to study photography in college, influenced by her grandfather's legacy and her own growing passion for the medium. She continued to visit Margaret regularly, bringing her photographs to share and critique. And Margaret felt proud to play a small role in the girl's development as an artist and a person. They talked about Tom often, keeping his memory alive not through grief, but through celebration. Recognizing that the best way to honor him was to live as he had lived, making their choices deliberately and owning them fully, refusing to let their stories remain untold. Victoria moved back to Portland, taking a job that paid less, but allowed her to be closer to Amber and to the community her father had loved. She and Margaret became close friends, bonding over their shared loss and their determination to live more consciously in the time they had remaining. They volunteered together at the community center, organized neighborhood events, and generally made themselves useful in the way Tom had always been, quietly contributing without expecting recognition or reward. Margaret noticed that Victoria had begun photographing ordinary moments, carrying one of her father's cameras and documenting her life with the same attention he had brought to his. As Margaret approached her 52nd birthday, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed in just over a year since that Christmas Eve dinner she had witnessed. She had transformed from an isolated observer into an engaged participant. From someone who watched life happen to someone who actively shaped it. She had reclaimed her music, found her voice as a writer, built meaningful relationships, and learned to honor her own story instead of keeping it hidden. All of this had started with Tom's quiet courage in revealing himself, in placing that envelope on the table and trusting that truth mattered more than comfort. She thought about the photograph Tom had taken of her playing piano, the one he had given her, and she understood now what he had seen in her that she hadn't seen in herself. He had recognized another person who had deferred their dreams for love, who had chosen the small moments over the grand stage, who carried hidden depths that deserved to be acknowledged. By photographing her, by making her visible, he had given her permission to see herself clearly, to claim her full story, to stop hiding behind her window and step into the complex, messy, beautiful world of genuine human connection. The neighborhood continued to evolve, with Tom's legacy rippling outward in ways both visible and invisible. The exhibition at the community center became an annual event, with different neighbors sharing their stories each year, creating a tradition of revelation and recognition. Margaret's piano students began performing publicly, sharing their developing talents with audiences who appreciated them. Victoria started teaching a photography workshop at the community center, passing on her father's techniques and philosophy to a new generation. Amber's college photographs began winning awards, and she always credited her grandfather's influence, making sure his story was told alongside her own achievements. Margaret still sat by her window sometimes, watching the neighborhood, but she watched differently now, with compassion and curiosity rather than mere observation. She saw the young couple struggling with student loans and invited them for dinner, offering not advice but acknowledgement and connection. She noticed the elderly botanist walking more slowly and started accompanying her on her walks, learning about plants and lichens and the persistent beauty of small things. She watched children playing in the street and thought about all the adults they would become, all the choices they would make, all the dreams they would defer or pursue. And she hoped they would have people in their lives who saw them clearly and loved them fully. On the anniversary of Tom's death, Margaret, Victoria, and Amber gathered at his grave with flowers and photographs, standing together in the February cold, remembering him with love and gratitude. They talked about what they had learned from him, about visibility and choice, about living deliberately and honoring what matters. They acknowledged that grief was still present, but no longer overwhelming, transformed into something more like tender memory mixed with determination to live well in his honor. As they prepared to leave, Margaret noticed new snow beginning to fall, covering the graveyard in fresh white, and she thought about how every ending contains the possibility of new beginning, how every loss teaches us something about love if we're willing to learn. Walking back to their cars through the falling snow, the three women linked arms, supporting each other against the slippery ground and against the weight of loss and memory. Margaret felt grateful for this unexpected family, for the way tragedy and revelation had woven them together into something stronger than blood, something chosen and deliberate. She thought about Tom's photograph from Sudan, the one that had won awards and changed policies. And she thought about the photographs he had taken of his own family, of Margaret at her piano, of ordinary moments made extraordinary through attention and love. And she understood finally that both kinds of photographs mattered equally, that both kinds of lives had value, that recognition is nice, but not necessary for a life to be well lived and worth living. That evening, back in her own home, Margaret sat at her piano and played for hours, her fingers moving across the keys with confidence and joy, making music for no one but herself and for the memory of a neighbor who had taught her to honor her own story. Through the window, she could see lights coming on in houses across the street, families gathering for dinner, ordinary lives unfolding behind ordinary walls, each one containing depths and complexities she might never know, but could learn to respect and honor. She played until her hands ached, played through tears and laughter, played everything she had given up and reclaimed, played her gratitude and her grief and her determination to live fully in whatever time remained. The music filled her house and spilled out into the February night, carrying across the snow-covered lawns to her neighbors' ears, reminding them that beauty still existed, that sacrifice could be honored, that every person carried stories worth telling if only someone would listen. And Margaret played on, no longer invisible, no longer silent, finally fully present in her own life and in the lives of the people around her, bearing witness and being witnessed, seen and seeing, connected to the world in ways she had almost missed but had finally, gratefully discovered. The old man across the street had taught her that, had shown her through his own quiet courage that it's never too late to reveal yourself, to honor your choices, to claim your full story and live it out loud for whatever time remains.